Hey there, I recently had a student asking me about having double pawns in the center. He asked me if this is a bad thing or if they can help to control the center. And this topic, like many other topics in chess, is not so black and white, otherwise chess would probably be a lot easier and we might not even be playing this game. So what I'm gonna do today, I'm gonna show you a few positions where we get double pawns in the center, and we're gonna see some of the advantages and disadvantages, and more importantly, how they affect the main plans and ideas in a position. So without further ado, let's get started, and I'm gonna show you a position that we can get in the Italian game. So after e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to c4 and bishop to c5, we get the Italian game. And one of the main lines goes c3, and after knight to f6, attacking the pawn e4, d3 is a common move. And after d6, white castles, a6 is a common idea, planning to go bishop to a7, because white always has this idea of going before, attacking the bishop. And a4 is commonly played here, and after bishop to a7, rook to e1, black castles, h3 and h6. This is a position that has been played a lot. And after knight b to d2, here black has a very common way to go, which is the move bishop to e6. So the main idea is to trade the bishop on c8 for this very powerful bishop on c4, which is putting a lot of pressure on this diagonal. And here white normally trades, and after pawn takes, we see that black got double pawns on the e file. So now the position changed a lot because black can make use of the f file. For example, now this rook is going to be more active. We have a semi-open file. And this pawn e6 is controlling the f5 and d5 squares, which are very important squares. White very often has an idea to place a knight on those squares, which in this case white cannot do. White has this common idea of going knight to f1, to e3, and then aiming for f5 or d5. So the main point here is that now both sides will have to readapt to this new situation on the board. So we have a lot of games with this position, but I took one game where white went b4, which is a common idea for white, trying to gain some space on the queen side. And now in this position, black commonly goes for knight to h4, again trying to make use of the f-file. This knight might come to f4 as well. So black is going for active piece play. One idea that is quite risky for black in this position is to go d5. So one drawback of these double pawns is that now they have less mobility, because going d5 might weaken those pawns a lot. Here white has many options, but one idea is to go bishop to a3, planning to go b5, creating an attack against the rook and undermining the knight, which is defending the pawn e5. And in this case, when black has double pawns, black has to be very careful about trading pawns, because after we trade on e4 and knight takes, just to show you an idea, after black takes on e4, now black gets these two isolated double pawns. As we see later, in some cases, having those pawns is an option, but in this position I'm already liking white a lot, because these two pawns are always going to be targets for white. In this position, instead of taking on e4, black might try something like b5, preventing b5 by white, but even here after c4, white is already putting a lot of pressure against black's pawns. So in this position, what black gets for these double pawns is active piece play. So knight to h5, planning to go knight to f4 and then queen to f6 is a common idea. And white's main ideas here are to play on the queen side, and preparing a break on the center at the right time to undermine black's pawns might also be an idea. Now I just want to show you another similar position in the Italian game. Here black could play a similar idea of bishop to e6 and then allowing the double pawns after bishop takes and pawn takes. But in this game, black decided to go for rook to e8. And the idea is to go bishop to e6, but as we see, the follow-up is going to be different. After knight b to d2, a6 and a4, here black went for bishop to e6. If white doesn't trade, black is happy to trade this bishop for this bishop. So white took on e6. And now here taking on e6 makes a lot less sense, because since we know that one of the main advantages of these double pawns is to activate our pieces, the rook on f8 was a lot better than on e8. So if you plan to take on e6 with the pawn, then it is better to have the rook on f8 and not waste time. So here black took with the rook, and now we have a position which is actually very different, because Now the d5 and f5 squares are not controlled by a pawn. But on the other hand, it is going to be easier for black to try to play on the center. So here in the game, after b4, bishop to a7, queen to c2 and queen to d7, white played knight to f1. This is a common idea to bring the knight to either e3 or g3, aiming for these squares. That's why here black anticipated and went d5. So in this case, black is to play more on the center than on the king side. And here white went bishop to e3. If white takes on d5, then after knight takes, we see that in this case, black's pawns are not doubled. This pawn e5 now is well protected by the rook. So this position is quite playable for black. So white tried bishop to e3, and after bishop takes, here white took with the knight, which makes sense considering that white played knight to f1 and white wants to bring this knight towards the center. So here, for example, taking with the e-pawn would not make a lot of sense. Now this knight is very passive here. And additionally here, black has the option to take on e4, and after pawn takes, these double isolated pawns are not particularly useful here. So after knight takes, putting pressure on d5 and also aiming to go knight to f5, here black went knight to e7, and we get a fairly balanced position. But again, the main point is that here black didn't go for the double pawns in the center, and the plans and the ideas in the position were very different from the previous example where black took on e6 with the f-pawn. Now I want to show you another opening where we might get double pawns in the center. After e4 and d6 we get the Pirc defense, and after d4, knight to f6, knight to c3. In this position g6 is very common, but the move e5 has been played a lot here, and white's main continuation is to go knight to f3, keeping the tension in the center, but taking on e5 is an option. And after pawn takes, queen takes, and king takes, bishop to c4 is a common follow-up. White develops and puts pressure on the pawn f7, and here black could defend with king to e8. White gets a slight advantage there, but another idea that has been tried here is the move bishop to e6. And after bishop takes and pawn takes, black got double pawns in the center which are also isolated. In this case, black is mainly going for a very solid position, so one advantage is that these two pawns, they really control very important squares. And here white normally goes f3, and then knight to c6 is a common move, and after a move like bishop to e3, bishop to d6 is a very common move. Here white has tried many moves, for example knight to h3, and after king to e7, we see that this king is protecting these pawns, so white cannot attack them easily, and black's position remains to be very solid. And again, black might have ideas to place a rook on the f-file, maybe go knight to h5 and knight to f4. So this is quite a playable position for black, but something that black or the side having double pawns, particularly when they are isolated, is to be careful about going for an ending position. So let me show you this example where black traded a lot of pieces and ended up with this position where these two pawns, they lack mobility. Now white is even attacking one of them. And here it is really white the one who can try something in this position. So here white played a very nice g4. The main idea is that after the trade, then white can go for h4 and create a pass pawn. Even if black goes g5, then white can prepare this idea of h4, and white will get a pass pawn and black will not get anything in return. Or if black simply waits, then after pawn takes and pawn takes, white gets this idea of attacking this pawn h5, so here it feels like white is playing with an extra pawn. So this is one disadvantage of double pawns, not only double pawns in the center, that they have less mobility, and in an ending they might be a liability. In the game black tried h4, preventing these ideas, but even so white still has problems. White won bishop to d2, planning to go g5 and then attack this pawn. Black tried to play g5, preventing this idea, but now white has another target, and after bishop to e3, king to b4, and bishop takes, king takes and bishop to c5. This is just an ending position, but the main idea is that black's pawns are actually very weak. Black has a lot of isolated pawns. Black doesn't have any clear plan but to defend, and after king to b5 and bishop to e7, this knight has to be sitting there defending the g5 pawn, and after king to b6 and king to e3, now white has the idea to bring the king to the king side and attack black's pawns, so white has a clear advantage which he managed to convert. Another common scenario where we may get double pawns in the center is one side placing a knight on a central square and then getting that knight traded. For example, in this position, black went knight to e4, here white captured on e4, white had other options like rook to c1, but white traded on e4, and after pawn takes, we see that we get double pawns on the e file, and after knight to d2, here the move d5 is pretty forced to defend the pawn on e4, and here white took on d5. There was an idea to try to undermine these pawns by going a3 and b4, then planning to go b5, but taking on d5 is quite playable, and now white's idea was to try to undermine this pawn on e4, because black has a space advantage in the center, so it makes sense to try to attack that pawn. A fairly common mistake is to simply leave those pawns, for example going e3. So in this case, black is already getting an advantage with these two pawns that are limiting white's pieces a lot. The bishop now here is very passive. This knight on d2 is also not very good. Black might even knight to b4 here, planning to bring a knight to d3. So even though these double pawns, and particularly this pawn e4 in this case, they are quite good, now here white has the option to undermine these pawns by going f3. And here black trading on f3. If black goes e3, then this pawn is already pushing a bit too much, because after knight to f1, this pawn is going to fall. So here black traded, and now we get a very different position, because now black doesn't get these double pawns anymore. And here white took on f3. Again, here the captures are related to how white has the pieces placed. The rook on e1 was not doing a lot, so it makes sense to take with the pawn. We also control e4, so now we got a new situation where this rook now is making a lot of sense, putting pressure on the pawn e7. And here by going knight to e4 and then d5, now the e5 square is a bit weak. Black cannot control it with any pawn. So this is still quite a playable position. Black has ideas to attack this pawn on d4 as well, for example by going queen to b6. So in any case, we got a new pawn structure, and black doesn't have double pawns anymore, because white undermined those pawns after the move f3. And last position I want to show you, it is more of an exceptional position, but still quite nice to show, where white gets double pawns both on the d file and the e file. This is just very strange to have 4 pawns of the same color on the central files. Before that, let's evaluate this position. It might seem crazy at first sight, but actually white has a very large advantage. White even has 3 pawns for the exchange, so 3 pawns and knight for rook. So materially speaking, white is doing more than fine. And black has very weak pawns. White even has the idea to take on e6. And if black defends, for example, by going queen to c8, white has this very simple idea of going knight to e6, attacking the rook, but also rook to c1, putting pressure against the c pawn is a very strong idea. Not to mention that the pawn f4 is also under attack. So in this position, black took on e4, and after pawn takes, white got these very beautiful pawns on the center. So at least in the open, in the middle game, having 4 pawns in the center looks like a very good idea. But again, I've only seen this in one game, so I cannot make a case for this. But here these pawns are basically controlling a lot of squares and just limiting black's pieces. And in this position, black actually resigned, because white still gets the same idea of attacking these pawns, whereas white's pawns are just very solid. For example, after e6, white still gets the idea of going knight to e6 and rook to c1. So black is going to lose even more material. For example, after rook to c8, rook to c1, rook to e7 seems to be the only way to defend the pawn, but white can bring another piece by going bishop to a3, and then d6 or even bishop to d6. Is very strong. This pawn on c7 is pinned, so white is going to win even more material. So I hope that you have a much better idea about how to evaluate positions where you have double pawns in the center. If you want to know more about how to get better at chess, I have a free course that will provide you with a daily plan for that. So feel free to check the link in the description. In any case, thanks a lot for watching, and I see you in the next video.